when we discuss immigration in the U.S., and particularly when we do so in New York, we're always making comparisons. In some ways, this is always a comparative. Even when we don't make the comparisons, we're making the comparisons. And nowhere, no institution is this more obvious and is more part of the mission, really, than the Tenement Museum, which really is largely about connecting us to an immigrant past, but also increasingly about how that immigrant past and that immigrant experience is or isn't like the experience of immigrant New York today. And I should also say that no one has written more articulately about that particular issue than Nancy Foner, not only in this work, but in many of her previous books. That whole question of how the immigrant experience is compared to a sadly misremembered, often romantically and heroically misremembered, but nonetheless omnipresent immigrant story that we have in our minds. Are these comparisons unfair? Of course. They're also inevitable. One of the things that makes New York distinct, and Joe hit on a number of them, but I think one of the really interesting thing about New York is that a very large chunk of the native population, and including the native African American population, but particularly the native white population, still thinks of itself in ethnic terms, right? And still has some connection to its immigrant past. Now, mind you, it's not a question of New York has immigrants and the rest of the country doesn't, or the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren of immigrants, because these same people populate every other city in the United States, or most of the other cities in the United States. But there is, and I don't really have a time to speculate as to why, but an awful lot of folks turn into regular white Americans when they cross the Hudson. The cousins of New Yorkers who move to Los Angeles, very often start to think of themselves as part of the majority population. But the self-selected minority that actually stayed here, that got through Ellis Island and said, that's it, I'm not moving after this, and stuck within 4 miles of Ellis Island for the next 100 years, that particular group does seem to have, for various reasons, a sense of itself as connected to an immigrant past. So with that kind of comes the question about new immigrants, always. So how are they like or unlike the past? And since we have this heroic, exaggerated, romantic view of the immigrant parents and grandparents, do these new guys measure up? How are they doing? Will they, do all right? Will they not do all right? What sort of Americans are they likely to become? Or will they become Americans at all? What sort of New York and what sort of America gets created in the process? Okay? Now, in answering that question, or trying to at least deal with that question, we very often find ourselves dealing with the children of immigrants in addition to immigrants themselves. And here I was very struck by Annie's reference to the fact that the Tenement Museum is about immigration, but it's also about families. Okay? Because a big piece of that story, and even when we think about the stories of the immigrant past, as we immortalize it, a lot of the time we're actually talking about people who were born in this country, but who were the children of immigrants, right? Either the people who were born here of immigrant parents, or people who came here as small children, and how they remade themselves and how they remade their relations with their parents. And it's interesting, it came up in almost all of the presentations. Now, I've been writing about the children of immigrants in New York for some time, so I guess I first should just say very quickly why I think that's a very interesting group to look at. First, it's interesting, I think, for purely demographic reasons. And I won't go back through the slides, but Joe has got a nice slide, as you saw, about the different racial and ethnic compositions and the different nativity compositions of the different age groups in New York. Okay. If you're in your 50s or 60s, you can still live in a New York that has a lot of immigrants, but it's also largely a black, white, Puerto Rican city. If you are in your 20s, that New York is about as relevant as the one that had Dutch people and Algonquin Indians, right? If you're in your 20s, you live in a world in which the people with whom you compete for jobs, sit in classrooms with, date, go to nightclubs with, get into gang fights with, etc. The relevant folks, with whom you compare yourself, are overwhelmingly immigrants or the children of immigrants. And what's really interesting to me is children of immigrants are actually the biggest single group. I mean, if you divide the world up into people who emigrated as adults, people who are children of immigrants, immigrant parents but raised here, either born here or largely raised here, and the children of natives, that group of children of immigrants among people under age 40, between age 18 and 40, is the biggest group, right? Among the young adults, they're the dominant folks, okay? And I think that that's particularly interesting just for demographic reasons. To some extent, we talk about assimilation, and that's always the question I get. So are these folks going to assimilate the way assimilation into what? I mean, they're the majority, right? But they're also incredibly diverse, okay? Because New York isn't like Houston in that sense. They're incredibly diverse. So that experience of having parents from elsewhere, is a very modal experience within that age group. So much so that I think it starts to color the experiences not only of the immigrants but of the children of natives as well, and of the recent immigrants as well. Because in many contexts this will be the dominant group. Second reason I think it's interesting is I think being betwixt and between is inherently interesting. And when I started writing about the children of immigrants quite a few years ago at this point, one of the reasons that kind of motivated my interest initially is I had written a book on West Indian immigrants prior to this, and basically it was a guardedly optimistic kind of portrait of a community, and I would ask people, basically naively, what the problems that community leaders saw in their community. And here's a community that was beginning to make some real inroads in politics, that was fairly upwardly mobile in terms of income levels, had real issues in terms of race and rivalry with certain other communities, but at the same time, seemed to be doing reasonably well, had very high home ownership rates. When you talked to people in that community about what the problems were, the big problems was we're losing our children. What's happening to our kids? Our kids we brought our kids here so they could be Americans. And now they've become Americans. My God, it was, and both the notion, and of course you tell people that, the thing that they tried to do was protect their children, keep their children from being too American, but everything they had done in terms of their own mobility stories had virtually guaranteed a certain degree of Americanization, even at the time when they were telling their children, don't you dare become too American. Which they used as a phrase meaning you're beginning to lose all moral sensibility. The more I study the children of immigrants, however, and by the way, this is not just something that West Indians say. It's something, this is what Korean ministers do sermons about. This is what Ecuadorian community leaders talk about. This, go into any immigrant community in the city, this is the discourse. Okay. But the more I started to actually look at it, I came to the conclusion that, when you actually start talking to the children of immigrants, you get a very interesting and I think more nuanced story. I mean, then this question of, there's a problem of being between two worlds that we don't know, and they're kind of confused. They're not us, they're not them, they're mixed up, which you get a lot, and there's a lot of confusion about that. And this is not unique either to New York or to immigrant communities. In fact, if you talk to people who are studying immigrants in Europe, this is an even more common theme, that this displaced group between two worlds, where do they fit? The more I talked to immigrants, the children of immigrants rather, in New York, the more I was getting a different kind of story. A story that was basically, well, look, I know that my parents do not understand me because they do not understand. Every teenager in the history of the planet, including my own, has at one point or another said, Dad, you do have no idea what my life is like today. You just don't get it. You don't understand it. You don't know the pressures I'm under. You can't relate. You don't understand it. This was originally written in cuneiform or hieroglyphics, right? Everybody says that. But for the children of immigrants, it's really true. That people who should be your significant others, the people who should be your guides to how you become an adult, who became adults in a different society and are often spend a lot of their time sort of struggling to cope with this society, are very often extremely poor guides. into how to be adults. Okay, but at the same time, they've got ideas about it, right? But so does the world around you. I mean, imagine, just to pull a hypothetical for the moment, growing up in a world in which arranged marriage is an accepted norm, and then growing up around peers or with a mass media that is like raised on the Disney Channel, in which the plot of every single show is follow your bliss, follow your individual, happiness, and eventually, even if your parents hate it, they'll come around because they just want you to be happy. So do the thing that makes you happy as an individual, even if it has to piss your parents off. That is our pop culture. Boy, that doesn't fit in certain sectors, right? So this causes a lot of problems. This causes a lot of strife. This causes a lot of disagreements. But it also causes, I think, a certain kind of creativity. There's a certain moment that occurs in knowing well that your parents' way can't be your way, but at the same time that the popular culture around you isn't necessarily your way either, because you're dealing with your parents and you're dealing with your home community. And that in some ways you're going to have to pick and choose between them. And in fact, in some contexts, you're going to have to make it up, all new. Okay? And that's a very interesting and creative, if often painful and difficult moment for people to be in. And to be in a city in which the majority of the young adults are in that place makes that city a very interesting and, I think, potentially creative place to be in. Okay? And in some ways, getting back to the Tenement Museum, and this may be my own overly romantic, half-remembered moment, that's the New York of the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. Was like that dynamic was there. And it's also the New York of today. And it's going to be the New York of tomorrow, because no matter what happens to immigration, and there's every indication that large-scale immigration to the United States is now not old, but will continue for a very long time. Okay? But no matter what happens to immigration, the story of the coming of age of the children of immigrants is going to be the dominant cultural issue in this town for the next 40, 50 years, even if somehow immigration dramatically cut off, which I don't think is likely to happen. Now, having made that overly optimistic note on the children of immigrants, let me just very quickly point to a couple of what I think is dark clouds and potential issues that we have. For all the cultural creativity, we still have some serious issues. The children of immigrants, by and large, I won't go through all the data here, but if you look at educational attainment, if you look at what we're beginning to see in terms of income, if you look at labor force participation, look at how many jobs people have, there's a guardedly optimistic story to tell. I mean, basically, folks are doing better than their parents by almost every measure. They're doing better than natives of the similar race than themselves. They're not necessarily doing better than native whites, although that's a lot to ask in one generation. But white immigrants are doing better than the children of white immigrants do better than the children of white natives. The children of black immigrants do better than children of black natives. The children of Latino immigrants do better than children of Latino neighbors. The children of Asian immigrants do better than anybody. That's kind of educationally the bottom line. And it's also increasingly becoming true. Will people hit glass ceilings as they get more into the labor force, they get older? Almost certainly. Will those be detrimental? We don't know. There's still very big racial differences between the various groups. And race still counts. And there are many points of kind of life in which racial identity will end up trumping immigrant identity. And I'm thinking particularly in the anonymous encounter in the public street, which is, of course, a very New York thing because we spend so much more time in public than do most Americans. So if you think of stop and frisk, if there's a moment at which the children of West Indian Dominican immigrants turn into black people, it's when they get stopped by the cops. Okay? And that is I think that's one of the costs of our current policing policy that is not thought about enough. Okay? I think our education system is facing immense problems. At some levels, the immigrants are one of the stellar success stories, and the education system celebrates the immigrants. Stuyvesant High School, has got a large, I think the children of immigrants are the large majority at Stuyvesant at this point, as are most of the other exam schools. There are almost no African Americans or even black immigrants in Stuyvesant anymore. I mean, and the celebration of diversity has allowed us to turn the blind eye to the fact that the most selective high schools in the city have become far, far less black. Not more white, but far less black. And that's, I think, a dramatic problem, of the last 20 years. And in some ways, black-white segregation is a problem in this city that we've almost stopped talking about. In fact, to some extent, education reform, particularly the charter school movement, just assumes it. To some degree, we're almost assuming that the kind of educational settings that we need for some Latinos and African Americans and black immigrants are fundamentally different from the ones we need for whites and Asians. We've got a very competitive, choice-based system for whites and immigrants. We've got an increasingly small school, stay-in-the-neighborhood system, through the charters and maybe there's some reason for that, but I find the notion that different kind of kids need different kind of education systems, I find it very uncomfortable. I think that the biggest single problem is one that's been touched on before, and that is the growing proportion of the city that are being raised by undocumented parents. These include the children of immigrants who are our fellow citizens because of birthright citizenship, as well as people who came here at a very young age and are Americans in every conceivable sense except the legal one. Now, New York actually is better off in this sense than almost any other major city in the United States. The reason, first of all, because the number of unauthorized people is smaller here. For various reasons I don't have time to go into, we don't have the massive concentration of undocumented people that we do. And most of our undocumented people live, as Nancy has frequently pointed out, in mixed status families. So it's not like an isolation of a world of entirely undocumented people. They're often the people who are, living in families with people with legal permanent residence, with U.S. citizens, with people on various other kinds of visas. So it's a much more complicated setting. And I think in New York, thanks to city administrations of various ideological stripes, but who have recognized that we should be working on this, hasn't had the kind of anti-unauthorized, anti-illegal movement that other parts of the country have. Nevertheless, raising children, communities in which a large portion of the population don't have legal status, can't participate in the polity, are terrified of somebody calling 911 or the Bureau of Child Welfare because you might have hit your kid, is really, really bad for democracy, and it's bad for the children who get raised in those kind of depoliticized communities. And I think that this is a real challenge that we're going to have to face. It's particularly a challenge because, frankly, New York City, despite a third of our voters being immigrants, can't do anything about it on its own, precisely because it's a federal matter that has tremendous local costs. And city administrations have done a lot to try to ameliorate some of those issues. But the fact is, that growing undocumented population is kind of the great elephant in the room here, and it's going to be a long time before we're going to be able to do anything about it. It's something we really do have to do something about soon. Thank you very much.